Most preachers do not begin a homily with several caveats, but this morning's a bit different. The message this morning might be more accurately be thought of as two sermons in terms of themes. Not to worry, not two full-length sermons. We've been hearing from the book of 1 John for a few weeks, and I took the liberty to deviate from the given text for reasons I hope will be evident. Third caveat, I did not consult with Pastor Phil in making the decision to go in a different direction. So I was afraid he might not approve, and I didn't want to have the first argument between the senior pastor and chair of the elders in his last weeks of service. Fourth caveat, not only are we deviating from the 1 John series, this is not a biblical expository message like we are accustomed to hearing from Pastors Phil and Paula. So much for the caveats. First sermon. It was the first week of school in the fall of 1964, Iowa Mennonite School, now Hillcrest Academy. Industrial arts class comprising about 30 energetic ninth grade boys. Mr. Grass was the teacher. He was also the ag teacher. Several of our faculty members were just a year or two out of college, and unlike them, Mr. Grass was much older and more mature. He was a veteran teacher. He must have been at least 35 years old. While almost all of the younger teachers would go on to pursue graduate degrees, Mr. Grass already had a master's degree from Penn State University. He was a progressive thinker who had come to Iowa from eastern Pennsylvania, and he introduced the radical idea of no-till farming to the Iowa Mennonite community of farmers. And I'm guessing that a few of them, with no degrees and many years of farming experience, questioned the value of his Penn State degree. Now we might say, just another strange coastal idea foisted on the simple, hard-working folk in flyover country. Over time, however, those ideas took root and became accepted as best practices, and Mr. Grass was highly regarded, so much so that he was once voted into the lot for the ministry, though the lot did not fall on him. He opened that first class in the fall of '64 with a statement that had most of us young male students question his wisdom, if not his state of mind. If money were not an issue, I would go to school all my life. There are so many subjects I'd love to study. This was our first week of high school. Our goal was just to graduate. In fact, some of us weren't even thinking any further ahead than the basketball season. Who in their right mind would want to go to school all their lives, even if they could afford it? For whatever reason, I didn't overtly react to what I secretly thought was a bizarre notion. For once, I kept my mouth shut, which is a good thing because a few years later, Mr. Grass became my uncle by marriage. Full disclosure, Marilyn Grass Brubaker is a daughter of Mr. Alvin Grass and a first cousin to Pat. Alvin was a man of many talents and interests, which is why he wanted to go to school all his life. Before we graduated IMS, their family moved to Edson, Alberta, which is roughly halfway between Edmonton and Jasper. He built a house outside of that small town. They were pillars of the small Mennonite congregation in Edson. He taught in the public school in that small community until retirement, occasionally calling in late because he had killed a moose along the road and needed to dress it out. He regaled us with stories such as falling asleep sitting up against a tree on a hunting trip, only to wake up face to face with a bear. One accurate shot or it was all over. At least that's the way he told the story. Years later, I was a guest preacher from Heston College, and I told that going back to school story. And I confessed that if I didn't understand Mr. Grass as a ninth grader, I now understand as an adult. I would love to go back to school. I acknowledge that, like many students, it was not easy to narrow my interests at points in my academic career. I considered majoring in accounting, then I thought about psychology. I did pharmacy before landing in seminary. And Nelson, do you understand that the Greek word for pharmacopoeia in Greek is actually another word for witchcraft? I'm just saying that going from pharmacy to seminary Greek and hearing that was a bit of a jolt. Parenthetical word to students. Many of you will do jobs in your lifetime that don't even currently exist in 2024. And it's highly likely that you'll have careers in multiple fields before you retire. Your education is not primarily about preparing for a specific job. It's about building a foundation, developing life skills like emotional intelligence, collaboration, learning how to learn. Today is Back to School Sunday, as we've already been reminded. It's a time of the year that generates a wide array of emotions and thoughts and feelings, particularly for students and teachers and administrators and parents and everyone else who supports the work of a school, shaped by our ages, our roles, and our many other factors. Anticipation, anxiety, energy, nervousness, excitement, maybe fear, maybe a swirling mixture of all of these and more. Will my child make friends? Will he or she be challenged academically? Will I as a teacher connect well with my students and colleagues? Will I find a way to encourage the students with different learning styles? Will I as an administrator create an environment where the faculty and students will thrive? Do we have the personnel and financial resources to achieve our mission as a school? Will the school board support our current core mission or spend its time fighting culture wars? And what about the students whose gifts are not well suited for learning in a traditional academic setting? I invested most of my life in the academy, but I believe strongly that traditional measurements of intelligence and success in formal education are not always synonymous. Dr. Howard Gardner of Harvard University pioneered work back in 1983 that resulted in the identification of multiple intelligences. He came up with a list of 7 or 8, I think it's been expanded to 9, things like linguistic, logical, mathematical, musical, spatial, bodily, kinesthetic, interpersonal, intrapersonal, naturalistic. Our grandchildren will, with considerable glee, confirm that there's at least one intelligence on that list for which I earn failing grades. They'll be happy to tell you all about it if you ask. All of us possess several of these intelligences. Most of us are less gifted in one or more areas. Dr. Daniel Goleman, also of Harvard, later developed the concept of emotional intelligence, which research has shown us is even more important for success in life than what we typically think of as intelligence. So we may today be celebrating and focused on those who are returning to a formal academic setting in any capacity, but it's a good time for us to be reminded that learning for a lifetime is a worthy calling. To reference the Apostle Paul, people of faith should desire to progress from milk to meat in terms of spiritual diet. Thus endeth sermon number 1. Next Sunday, we will take time to celebrate Pastor Phil's long and exemplary service as a pastor, 40 years in total and the last 28 here at Park View Mennonite. So I'd like to take the rest of my minutes this morning to reflect on his legacy. I've jokingly told him that 40 years is amazing, and it is, but that relatively speaking, he's still mid-career. Last summer, Pat and I attended a funeral service in Julesburg, Colorado, for my uncle who had served one congregation for 58 years. He was called Methuselah by the other pastors in the community for a reason. The town is only about 1,000 residents, 1,200 and some the last I checked. And I don't think it was ever much larger than that in all those 58 years. But he conducted, as the town's pastor, more than 600 funeral services. Now, I want to be really clear, that record should not be the standard. Phil and Irene, you richly deserve a change of pace, time for new activities, or more time for favored involvements. And Phil, as I reflect on your impact on our congregation, several specific gifts seem obvious to me. Now, let me just make one other parenthetical statement. We've all had the experience of thinking that the preacher is speaking only to us in a sermon. This is primarily directed at Phil. Although I did tell him ahead of the service, it's not with the intention of making him feel guilty. I want to honor him, and the rest of you can listen in. Before naming 3 gifts, and every preacher in homiletics class is taught to have 3 points, there are many more gifts that Phil has. I will only identify 3. But before naming those, I think it's appropriate to clarify something, and that is that Phil's love of coffee is also biblically rooted. Now, I haven't verified this, but the rumor is that he was taking a New Testament course at EMS before he became a coffee aficionado, and it began when he took that course and learned that making coffee is a requirement for male leaders. Hebrews. Incidentally, we should all be grateful to Irene for keeping him grounded. First gift that I would identify, preaching and teaching. You've modeled for us a lifelong commitment to learning, both academically and in your exegesis of the biblical text. We don't regularly use formal titles for leaders in Mennonite congregations, but it would be appropriate to occasionally refer to you as Reverend Dr. Niss. Phil completed an MDiv degree in the days when that was a 3-year program comprising as much as 90 credit hours, and I'm assuming a substantial number of those were in Greek and Hebrew. Later completed a DMin, Doctor of Ministry degree at Northern Baptist Theological Seminary near Chicago, and that work resulted in what we have referred to as a community of communities. Phil's sermons have been deeply rooted in the biblical text and have regularly included a new way of thinking about a meaning of a particular text. I've heard that said numerous times after Sunday mornings. People would have said to me, well, that was a different way to look at that text. And I know for Pat and me, that's often been a part of our conversation following a Sunday morning sermon. A text that seems familiar to many of us, and he brings a new way of thinking about that text based on his deep study of the Scripture. By the way, he's kept, as many of you might know, he's kept a copy of every one of the more than 1,100 sermons that he's preached. And that relates to a second gift that I'll come to in a moment. I tried to keep copies of my sermons from 30, 40 years ago, but in one of our many moves, The paper-based sermons were still in boxes in a basement that had not been unpacked, and the basement was flooded. So my friend said, well, they were dry anyway, so what's the problem? Your gift for teaching has been evident in your preaching ministry, and I think it's not an exaggeration to suggest that your sermons have been a kind of mini seminary class in biblical interpretation. I've not heard this in this congregation, but I've heard it other places. Not uncommon to hear someone in church say they want to hear more, quote, biblical preaching. Forgive me for being just slightly skeptical. It's frequently quote for more sermons on current cultural issues and or sin, so long as that sin applies to someone else. You, Phil, have given us a window into the biblical text with a bridge to our current world, and you have consistently reminded us we are loved by God, we are called to love each other, and we are invited to follow Jesus. And I think it's safe to say very few pastors have surpassed you in what I would call biblical preaching. Gift of administration. One of your gifts, that of administration, will become even more obvious in its absence when you're no longer with us. And I know that the elders and the congregational council are grateful for the enormous amount of work you've been doing in the last weeks and months to create videos and systems that are available to people who will need to pick up some of those administrative tasks. And that is a tremendous gift to all of us. Your gift for communication, both oral and written, has profoundly shaped our congregational life, publicly and behind the scenes. You'd be the first to admit and to remind us that our community is blessed with a vast array of gifts that is true of any healthy congregation. And with the support of several with technology gifts, you led us through the nearly unprecedented pandemic crisis with creativity, hard work, and a can-do spirit. And that required hours of extra work on your part as well as people who run the technology for us. And we continue to benefit enormously from those adjustments, allowing many to join our community from a distance via technology. And I think it's probably safe to say, Sarah, that seminary courses are not heavy on technology, and courses in administration are generally maybe 3 credit hours. And it's true that many pastors name administration as their least favorite responsibility. It's not why they went into ministry, but it's a critical function that someone needs to attend to, and you, Phil, have graced us with that gift. Third, gift of compassion. One of the many blessings of a long pastorate is the opportunity to connect deeply with congregants throughout the various stages of life, from birth to death, and all the life experiences between. Pastors know that walking with a family through illness and tragedy and untimely deaths, or memorializing a long life well lived, is a sacred experience, and it is holy ground. And it's a bond between pastor and family that is deep and long-lasting. And as has often been noted in your ministry, funeral meditations have been particularly meaningful because it's a combination of the personalization and a reminder of God's presence in a time of grief. Pastoral ministry is deeply rewarding. It's psychologically draining, spiritually challenging, physically exhausting, and sometimes also energizing. It's full of sorrow and joy, sometimes in the same day, even within hours. And as with any leadership role, it simultaneously requires sensitivity and resiliency. And it's rarely boring, particularly in a large congregation such as Park View. Effective pastors are emotionally intelligent, good listeners, empathetic, able to hold the deepest struggles of congregants in confidence, quick to laugh, and not afraid of tears. Thank you, Phil, Reverend Dr. Niss, or maybe we could even go so far as to say Most Reverend, for your many years of servant leadership. Thank you for modeling what it means to be a faithful follower of Jesus. And to both of you, Phil and Irene, we look forward to honoring you next Sunday with more tributes and appreciation. Well done, thou good and faithful servant.